Welcome to Miss Retro Reads, and we continue with our reading of the life of St. John Vianney. Chapter 18, The Saint. The evidence for the sanctity of the Curé de Ars is down in black and white. The witnesses had nothing to gain. The only thing that brought them to the witness stand was concern for the truth. Let us hear them as they testified at the canonization process. Dr. Jean-Baptiste Saunier, who was the Curé de Ars' last doctor and who visited him from 1842 to 1859, said, "My relations with the servant of God were those of the closest friendship, and I never thought of him as anything but a perfect model of all the virtues. If he isn't a saint, there never will be one," testified the Ars wheelwright André Virchet. He was always and everywhere, in the fullest sense of the word, a perfect priest, a model curé, and a man of God, declared Viscount Jean-Félix des Garrettes. "I have never seen a truer copy of the divine master," added a priest, the Abbé Dubois, curé of Ferrines. "I saw in him the perfection of virtues. He was the living image of the supernatural life. The motive of all his actions and of all his life was faith." These were the words of other ecclesiastics, the Abbés Descotes, Gardet, and Raymond. "I've seen God in a man," was the magnificent exclamation of a simple vine-grower of the Macon country as he left Ars. He was not heroic only in one virtue, but in all, and not for a time, but all his life. Even the reading of the life of the saints had not given me such an exalted idea of sanctity. These were the admiring phrases in which the ecclesiastical court held. There was no exaggeration. Of two faithful penitents of the Abbé Vianney's. Finally, after the penitents, here is the testimony of the curé's own confessor, the Abbé Louis Bayou, a curé of Jessens. "I do not believe he relaxed for a single day. He fulfilled his duties as a priest and a shepherd of souls with an admirable scrupulousness of conscience, and he persisted till his death in the strict discharge of all his duties. Words fail me. I do not think it would be possible to go further in the practice of the heroic virtues. He was surrounded with an aura of sanctity. It would be impossible for me to express the degree to which he inspired me with veneration and respect. He had, in my judgment, preserved the grace of baptism, and had constantly increased his grace by the outstanding sanctity of his life. The Curé de Ars possessed virtue to a heroic degree. There was no question of his experiencing merely transitory inclinations to perform virtuous acts. Faith, charity, humility, love of poverty, patience, mortification, and zeal were habits of virtue of the Christian and sacerdotal life that he practiced throughout his existence in an outstanding fashion. Faith, he said once, summing up in a single phrase the ideal prayer, "Faith is when you talk to God as you would to a man." For him, the riddles and the obscurities of our earthly exile seemed to have disappeared when he talked about his congregations of the great mystery of the world to come. They might have thought he was already in the homeland. Wherever he was and whenever he spoke, he displayed the faith in his mind. It was impossible to conceive a situation, however humble and commonplace in outward appearance, into which he would not slip a lofty thought or a phrase with overtones of the divine. One day he was crossing the little yard of his presbytery, where some chickens, which had got there from one of the village farms, were pecking about in the grass. He stopped to look at them, and then began jokingly to compare their way of living to his, reflecting on their freedom of movement and their heedlessness. "How lucky they are," he said, and then correcting himself, no, they haven't got souls, and they can't know what it means to love God. And the saint continued on his way to the church and the confessional, the prison where he passed all his days and a great part of his nights. Another time, on his way from the presbytery, he stopped to listen to the birds singing in the elder trees in the yard, and this time he sighed, for they had made him think of sinners. Poor little birds, he said, you were created to sing, and you do sing. Man was created to love God, and he doesn't love him. The same thing happened to him in the Savigny Road. He related in one of his catechism classes. One day, said the Abbé Tocquenier, his assistant, I remarked to him in passing, fine day today, Monsieur le Curé. It's always fine for the good, he replied. It's only bad weather for sinners. In ways like this, he brought everything with which he came into contact under a Christian, a supernatural light, as effortlessly as a plant bears its flowers. What is more, he had taught his divine art to the farmers and the workmen of his parish. For them, as well as for him, the skyline of Ars, its undistinguished hills and the cool valley of the Fontainebleau, the harvests and the flowers talked a mysterious language. Creation made them think of the Creator, attentive to the tolling of the hours, as their curé had instructed them. They interpreted their work 10 times in the day to recite the Hail Mary. For the unbeliever, an existence like that of the Abbé Vianney must remain inexplicable, and even for Christians of the shallow and tepid kind, there will probably be an element of mystery about it. For it is impossible for anyone to understand such a life who has not penetrated to its ultimate source in addition to a faith that would move mountains. The Curé d'Ars, in the simple and all-embracing phrase of St. Paul, had charity. The ardor of his gaze when he was at the altar spoke plainly enough of this love. In conversation, when the talk strayed from the interests and the glory of God, he seemed tongue-tied. It was obvious that his inspiration had left him. On the other hand, if it were a question of religious festivals, of missions, or conversations, or of current events that reflected on religion, he came to life at once, would be by turns all excitement and all smiles, and would spontaneously exclaim his thanks to God. He was a wonderful preacher because his sermons came straight from a heart overflowing with love. I heard him preach in the concluding years of his life. Martha Descartes, daughter of the mayor of Ars, testified at the canonization process. His preaching by then was nothing but an outburst of faith and of love, often accompanied by an uninterrupted flow of tears. His sermons conveyed the impression of a prayer, indeed, almost of an ecstasy. When he talked of the Eucharist, and he never took a single catechism class when he did not talk of it, his gestures, said Brother Athanase, his gestures became livelier and his voice stronger, and there was more fire in his look. He would turn towards the tabernacle, clasping his hands or pointing his finger, and then he would burst into tears till his voice was often drowned in sobs. He had a love for the Blessed Virgin that was as tender as it was fervent, as filial as it was tender. He celebrated all her feast days as if it had been his own mother, whom he could see before his eyes. One evening he took the opportunity of recounting from the pulpit all the things he had done for the glory of the Queen of Heaven. If it were possible to sell myself in order to give something else to the Blessed Virgin, sell myself I would, he concluded. The day when the dogma of the Immaculate Conception was proclaimed in Rome, Friday, December 8th, 1854, he recognized in his village of Ars what Madame Desgaretz described as an enormous demonstration of joy. In the morning he insisted on singing High Mass himself, robed for the occasion in magnificent vestments of blue velvet embroidered with gold. In the evening the whole village was illuminated, and the Abbé Vianney himself sounded the big bell to give the signal for the rejoicings. That evening he took a holiday. He abandoned the confessional, and in the words of Catherine, strolled about happily by the light of the torches amid the priests who were there and the brothers. It was his love of God and his enthusiasm for the glory of God that inspired in the Curé d'Ars such an immeasurable devotion for souls and such a compassion for sinners. What a tragedy it is to think that there are men who will die without loving God, he exclaimed in one of his catechism classes. Unhappy sinners, he said on another occasion, in tones it is impossible to describe. If only I could confess for them. Confess for them, of course, he could not. But there was a sense in which he could suffer and expiate for them, sacrifice himself, in order to win for them a feeling of repentance and the grace of pardon. The devil, we have seen, redoubled his attacks on the Abbé Vianney in the fury he felt when he foresaw the arrival of some great sinner who had already been bruised by the wing of remorse. The servant of God, for his part, redoubled his prayers and penances. In the days preceding the great feasts, and especially at Easter time, relates the schoolteacher Jean Pertinard, he imposed the most extraordinary fasts on himself. The mayor of Ars, M. Desgaretz, declared that it was indeed his love of souls that led him to dedicate himself for the whole length of his long life to a crushing ministry without interruption, without stint, without relief of any kind, that made him get up at midnight or 1 in the morning and leave the church very late, that condemned him to an almost complete privation of sleep, and that nevertheless preserved in him an unvarying patience in the midst of the most nerve-wracking solicitations. These lines present a whole program of asceticism and sanctity. They are a moving epitome of the Abbé Vianney's existence during the 41 years of his pastorate at Ars. But it may help us to see into the secrets of his inner life if we follow him in his daily practice of the virtues he exemplified. For the last 20 years of his life the curé lived in an atmosphere of admiration and of celebrity. He was quite conscious of it, but he also realized the reason. What people had come to see in him was a saint. What is to say, the living result of the grace of God. Believing this as he did, he directed all the tributes he received to God. I never once detected a sign of pride in his heart or heard a word of pride on his lips, was the testimony of the priest who had seen him from close and who felt no exaggerated friendliness for him. The reason was that he never lost consciousness of his own nothingness, never forgot his condition as a creature. He had on his own admonition received from heaven the grace of knowing his own destitution. I was so terrified by the revelation, he confessed one day to Brother Athanase, that I immediately begged for the grace to forget it. God heard me, but he left me with enough knowledge of my own worthlessness to make me understand that I am capable of nothing. Descending deeper yet into this abyss of humility, the curé, after referring to God all the good, would reflect on all the evil that he, poor creature, as he was, might have committed if God in his mercy had not preserved him. I am the last of men, he would groan. If God had not spared me, what might I not have become? Moreover, he believed that he said when he asked his bishop for the permission to hide himself away in some obscure corner, a Trappist or a Carthusian monastery, to weep there over his unhappy life. It was because he was ready to go. He even talked sometimes of presenting himself some day at the gate, some faraway monastery, and asked for admission without saying whence he came or who he was, as if the thing were possible. In fact, there was not a place in the country where the most celebrated priest in France would not have been recognized. His characteristic features had become known everywhere, thanks to the picture of every kind that the Ars shopkeeper sold to pilgrims. It is no exaggeration to say that these pictures, in their various degrees of likeness, had been circulated throughout the Catholic world by the millions. The curé was very unhappy about it first, and would have liked to put a stop to these representations of him. There were, however, poor children who went about with them attached to their necks, and who helped their parents eke out a living by selling the pictures. The Abbé Vianney's heart was touched. He gave in, and in the end he brought himself to laugh at this pictorial persecution. "How much are you selling that for?" he would ask a little girl. That was a colorized picture in which the curé, a high flush on his face, was represented between the verses of a broadsheet ballad. "2 sous, monsieur le curé," the child replied. "2 sous. That's more than enough for the figure of fun it makes me." There were other kinds of intrusions, however, that always distressed him. The pilgrims wanted relics, and they had no scruples about the way they got them. When the saint passed through their ranks, more than one of the men and women who bowed their heads before his blessing would be holding a pair of scissors with which they would snip a piece off his surplice or his cassock. When he was taking his catechism class in the low stall which is still to be seen in the church, it was nothing out of the way for the book he placed beside him to vanish as if by magic several times. He often lost one or the other volumes of his breviary, while people would actually pull his hair out to get relics. All this, Monsieur de Guéret said, caused him real unhappiness. "What mistaken devotion," he murmured one day, when he found the skirt of his cassock tattered with holes and tears without origin he knew only too well. The diet the Abbé Vianney adopted when he first arrived at the presbytery was Spartan in its austerity. It was a penance that he continued for the rest of his life. He never touched anything he liked. He had been brought up in the country, and as a boy he had a hearty appetite that asked for nothing better than farmhouse food. But even this food now seemed too luxurious for him. As long as he was his own master, as he would say when talking of the years when his time had been a little freer and he could cook for himself, he lived on plain boiled potatoes. He would eat them cold, and all he had to do with them was to scrape off the mold. As the supply he prepared once a week neared its end, the time came, however, when penitents began flocking to his confessional in such number that he had no time to do anything else but say his Mass, recite his breviary, and sleep perhaps 2 hours a night. When that moment came, the curé turned to the headmistress of Providence, whom he asked for the charity of a little soup, some vegetables. He would eat this meal in the middle of the day, and he would take nothing else till the next day. Even his doctor could not persuade him to drink a little milk in the evening. He would take nothing, not even half a glass of water, after confessing without a stop for 8 long hours. Yet in summer, the nave of his church, with its low roof and the throng of pilgrims that always filled it, became an oven. In his final years, it would quite likely have been impossible for him to adopt a more plentiful diet, for his stomach had shrunk and would not have taken it. But that cannot have been the case till he was gone 60, and it was through a continuous act of will and of heroism that he suffered hunger and thirst. One evening a number of his parishioners turned up to deposit the supply of grain needed for the orphanage in the presbytery garret. The Abbé Vianney, who had come back to the presbytery for the occasion, received them in what before his time had been the dining room, and insisted on offering them a drink. One of them commented later on the tiredness of his face and the dryness of his lips. When all the glasses but one had been filled, someone proposed a toast. The Abbé Vianney quickly lifted the empty glass and explained with a smile that disarmed any suspicions. "Wine doesn't agree with me." Even on the most sultry evening, he would not so much as wet his lips with a drop of water. One day, when he had something to talk over with Jean Quinier, who had a farm opposite the old church, the saint found the family about to sit down to their midday meal. At the moment he entered, the mistress of the house had just served up a huge dish of smoking potatoes. "They look very good," the curé could not help remarking. They were very pleased, and was not in the least surprised when their visitor helped himself to a potato. But much to everyone's astonishment, the Abbé Vianney, after keeping it and looking at it for a moment, put it back in the dish. It was a penance he was imposing on himself, said Antoine, one of the children who were witnesses of this little scene. During the last 5 years of his life, the curé did finally consent, on the orders of his physician, Dr. Saunier, to abate his austerities a little, and he promptly accused himself of gluttony. Here is the evidence of this gluttony, as told by his confessor, who was present time and again at his famous penitence meals. He took his meals in his room, once the Sisters of St. Joseph of Bourg started to run Providence. The Abbé Bayeux reports, and he never sat down. On the table, which had no tablecloth, was an earthen plate containing a few vegetables, sometimes 2 eggs or a little meat. If he was really tired, he never ate meat without asking my permission, a jug of water, a bottle of red wine, and a little bread. The meal was over in less than 10 minutes. The Abbé Vianney ate so as not to taste what he was eating. The greater part of the food that had been served up was always left over in the dish, and he had only drunk a little water barely colored with wine and eaten a few mouthfuls of bread. I was enormously impressed by this inordinate abstinence. To become what he had become, the Count d'Esquerets testifies finally, had cost him an unimaginable effort, for the Curé d'Ars was a creature of flesh and blood like ourselves. His human nature, too, urged him to satisfy his appetites and to seek his comfort. In order to imitate his divine master and to win souls for him, he had preferred to live a life of mortification and of a living martyrdom. Saint Jean-Marie Vianney offers us in his way of life one of the noblest examples of the victory of grace over nature. Moreover, while he was tormenting his poor corpse by his heroic abstinence, he was continuing in the secret of his room to scourge himself for the good of souls. Only God knows how many disciplines he used on his macerated flesh. When it is realized that these disciplines were made of links of iron, it is easy to share the feelings of Catherine or of Brother Athanase, when they found under his furniture old links of chain that had been broken off by the violence he struck. One day, when he had fainted in the church, a group of men carried him up to his room and discovered, when they undressed him, that he was wearing round his waist an iron chain an inch thick, with spikes sticking out of it. He used to, in addition, wear iron bracelets, also blistering with sharp spikes, on both his arms, and the final touch was a long horsehair shirt whose rubbing had caused what must have been an extremely painful sore. When the saint was undressed after his death, witnesses saw with astonishment that he had never taken off this rough hair shirt day or night. Made of horsehair and rope woven together, the penitential garment was so worn that only a few fragments survived, which the witnesses, led by Brother Athanase, took and kept as precious relics. One can but endorse the opinion of a man accustomed to penance in all its severity, a monk of the Grande Chartreuse, when he exclaimed, with profound humility, "All of us solitaries, hermits, penitents of every kind, must confess that if we dare follow the Cure de Ars, it is only with our eyes, and that we are not worthy to kiss his footprints or the dust of his shoes." Chapter 19. The Miracles in the Life of the Cure de Ars. 1. Miraculous Cures and Intuitions. It does not necessarily happen that a saint's outstanding virtues manifest itself by extraordinary facts during his lifetime. It was St. Paul himself who wrote to his Corinthians that it is better to have charity than to move mountains. Miracles, it must be remembered, provide evidence of sanctity. They do not constitute it. There have been men and women of surprising holiness who have not worked a single wonder in the course of their earthly existence. Saint Therese of the Child Jesus is an excellent example. Though she was favored with certain extraordinary graces, she never accomplished a single miracle in her lifetime. The nearest she came to it was to predict to one of her sisters in a conversation a little before her death her own heavenly mission of benefactress and converter of souls. That was the only time in her life she showed any sign of the wonderful gift of supernatural intuition. Things were different with the Cure de Ars. It was the will of God that his sanctity should be proclaimed during his life by a whole series of miracles. His mission was to attract to his confessional sinners in need of conversion, and the marvelous became in his hands a redoubled instrument of apostleship. His miracles were of more than one kind. By his prayers he obtained the immediate cure of the crippled, the sick, and the instantaneous transformation of guilty souls. And these latter wonders, which the eye could not detect, and to which reference has already been made, were probably the most numerous of all. In addition, the Cure de Ars, with the aid of enlightenment from above, revealed the secrets of consciences, foretold the future, and pierced with his gaze into the mysteries of the next world. Up to the moment of his death, the Abbé Vianney would never ask for a miracle of healing except through the intercession of his dear little saint of the catacombs. "Go and ask Saint Philomena," he would tell sick people who came to him. "I don't work miracles. I'm nothing but a poor ignoramus who used to keep sheep." With phrases like this, he was able to hide his humility behind the renown of the young martyr. All the same, quite a number of the cures occurred spontaneously. Here it was somebody to whom he had just laid hands and who got up completely recovered. There it was someone whom he had promised to pray and who was revealed in his affliction before he had time to stammer his thanks. At moments such as these, the curé would be embarrassed, almost annoyed, and would hasten to refer all the credit for the wonder and its solicitation to his charge d'affaires, his counsel at the court of God. He did not always succeed in imposing on people in this way. His admirers settled things by accepting the fact that the saint on earth and the little saint in heaven were associates in prayer, and thus the miracles that were done in the village of Ars were the work of two pairs of hands. A certain Madame Raymonde Kervere had been suffering for 8 years from tuberculosis. She had got to the point where she could not utter a word without horrible suffering, reduced to complete dumbness by her pain. She made use of signs to communicate with people or wrote on a slate. In May of 1843, she came to Ars. "My child," the saint told her, "go and leave your slate on the altar of Saint Philomena." She had no sooner left it than she found she was cured, and on August 11th of the same year, on the feast of Saint Philomena, it was she who intoned the chants and led the singing at the Mass. Not dissimilar was the experience of a paralyzed woman in the department of the Loire who had started to reel off the whole long story of her woes to the Abbé Vianney, whose time was so precious. The servant of God interrupted her before she had time to pronounce more than a couple of sentences. "Go and tell all that to Saint Philomena," he said. The woman hobbled round to the chapel of the little saint and told her story. She had barely finished it when she found herself completely cured, and at the Providence Orphanage, where she ran with her news, the whole staff joined in her rejoicing. A poor woman who could only walk with the help of crutches had put herself in the Abbé Vianney's way between the presbytery and the church, when the saint appeared, accompanied by his curate, the Abbé Tauquenier. This time the curé d'Ars had no recourse, in appearance at least, to his dear little saint. He simply said to the cripple, "Well, my good woman, walk." When the woman hesitated to abandon her crutches, the Abbé Tauquenier, in tone as much of amusement as of reproof, added, "Why not walk when you're told to?" The woman dropped the crutches. Her legs were as sound as her neighbor's, and her first steps were firm. Pointing to the now useless crutches, which spoke only too eloquently of the fact of the miracle, the Abbé Vianney concluded, "And now take those away with you." It was the best way he could think of to cut short the applause of the crowd. One morning in 1854, Mr. and Mrs. Besancon were attending the curé's mass at the Ars church. They had brought with them their 5-year-old daughter, Mathilde, who was a pitiful sight to see. One day the poor child had been lifted off the ground by a bigger friend, who had seized her by the head, and the trick crippled her. The only way she could hold her head straight now was by wearing an iron collar lined with leather, which imprisoned her neck up to the chin. Every doctor her parents had called in had agreed that the affliction was incurable, and all this had happened many months before. The Abbé Vianney had promised to pray for Mathilde, and Mr. and Mrs. Besancon were also praying fervently. Suddenly, at the elevation, the child exclaimed, "Mommy, I'm cured, look!" It was quite true. Mathilde was smilingly turning her head with complete freedom, and all that remained to do was to take off her tortuous collar. A girl from the Sion et Loire department had begged the Abbé Vianney to cure one of her legs, which was almost 3 inches shorter than the other. The curé did not refuse to pray for the cure, but he asked God to make it at the same time profitable to the girl's soul, for he had read into her conscience. "You disobey your mother too often," he told her. "If you want God to cure you, you must get rid of that ugly habit. You'll have to make a big effort, too. Remember this. You will be cured, but it will be little by little, according to as you try to turn over a new leaf." The lesson went home. The harder the girl tried to be obedient, the more her crippled leg grew, and the day she had learned to obey without question, she found herself completely cured. The same sort of thing happened to a young man from the Puy-de-Dôme, whose legs were paralyzed, and who could not move without crutches. His faith was no longer than his limbs. His relatives took him to the village of Ars, where the curé advised him to make a novena to Saint Philomena. The advice was fruitless. The novena terminated with the young man showing no more devotion than before. The Abbé Vianney ordered a second novena and promised that if it were well done, the cripple would be able to lay his crutches before Saint Philomena and would never need them again. Little by little the young man began to change. He prayed better and was preparing to celebrate devoutly the feast of the Assumption, which happened to coincide with the end of his second novena. In the morning he attended the Abbé Vianney's Mass, and after it was over dragged himself as best he could through the crowd that was thicker even than usual, and entered the sanctuary. "Come now, Monsieur le Curé," he said to the curé. "Tell me yes or no. Is it today that I am going to be able to offer my crutches to Saint Philomena?" "Off with you, my good fellow," the saint ordered. The young man was cured on the spot, and the first thing he did was to lay his crutches as a votive of offering before the Curé d'Ars' little saint. That was not the end of it, however. The cripple had not only been cured, he had been converted in such earnest that he was soon often received as a novice by the brothers of the Holy Family of Belay. The power which God had bestowed on Saint Jean Marie Vianney for the relief of human suffering extended to an even wider field, and particularly to the world of souls, in which indeed he seemed to live. Time and again, writers who talked about him have called him the seer. That was the term used of certain Old Testament prophets, and the Ars pilgrims treated the Abbé Vianney as if he had inherited the gifts of these great figures, whose mission had been to convert or to lead Israel, when they came and asked him either to enlighten their conscience or to unveil the future. I have heard many people say, a missionary who was called as a witness at the canonization process testified, that they had consulted the Curé d'Ars on their vocation, on lawsuits, on family difficulties, on sicknesses, and on decisions which they had got to take, and that he had always answered with extraordinary accuracy. To a number of them he foretold events which occurred later. He showed his knowledge of the conscience and spiritual depositions of many of them in a way that overwhelmed them with astonishment. Facts of this kind in life of the saint would always certainly run into thousands if a complete collection could be made. A certain number became known through stories told by pilgrims, and some were taken into account at the canonization process. Investigations carried out since then by Canon Ball, vice postulator of the cause of the Curé d'Ars, and his third successor in the parish, have verified several hundreds of these supernatural facts, those of which the circumstances are known in some detail, therefore probably number quite 500, which means that a writer who wishes to give examples has almost too much material to choose from. One day in 1857 or 1858, a very worried father set out for Ars. His son, who was in the top form of his junior seminary, was going in for an examination, and his master said he had very little chance of getting through. As for the headmaster, he was equally concerned about a number of other candidates. The father had only to enter the Ars church to see that he would have to wait for his information. Supposing the Abbé Vianney could give him any help at all about the approaching examination, for the building was overflowing with pilgrims. Since he was a civil servant, he had not got unlimited time at his disposal, and he had no success in getting near the servant of God. So on the evening of the day after his arrival, he begged Brother Jerome to get the Abbé Vianney to see him, if it were only a minute. There was no certainty that his request would be granted, for the confessional was besieged, and Brother Jerome could promise no more than that he would do his best. A moment or two he came out all smiles, and whispered a message into the anxious pilgrim's ear. "The curé told me to tell you that your son will pass, and all the other candidates at the junior seminary will pass too." "But the curé doesn't even know what I was going to ask him," stammered the father, who was as delighted as he was thunderstruck. "Oh, the curé doesn't need people to go into details like that," said the brother, without showing the least surprise. Naturally, not a word about the prediction was said to the boys of the top form, and the father and the few people he had told waited for its fulfillment with a confidence in which there was not a little curiosity. When the official results were announced, of course, every one of the candidates entered at the Autun Junior Seminary was found to have passed, as Saint Jean-Marie Vianney had calmly foretold from the obscurity of his confessional. Just as astonishing is another story of which a schoolboy is the hero. One day in June of 1855, a boy was lying in the infirmary of Lons-le-Seigneur boarding school, dying of typhoid fever. His mother had hurried to his sickbed, and on her entreaty, the headmaster had just sent his form master off to the village of Ars. Ars was a long way away, however, and the agonizing question on everyone's lips at Lons-le-Seigneur was whether he would be able to arrive in time. Hope had almost faded when, on the afternoon of the following day, the patient suddenly emerged from his coma, opened his eyes, and said he wanted to get up. The doctor was sent for at once and said immediately that the boy was not only out of danger, but already on the way to convalescence. It may be asked what had been happening meanwhile at Ars. It was an astonishing story. It was already night when the form master reached the village, to find the church closed and surrounded by a crowd several hundred strong. When a day came, he soon gave up hope of getting to the Abbé Vianney by joining the long lines for his confessional, and decided to wait for him outside. As things turned out, he found himself in the way of the saint as he was returning from a visit to a sick parishioner, and the curé, who did not even know of his existence, beckoned him to approach. "I think you've come to see me about Joseph, the schoolboy who is ill," he said. "Write and tell his parents from me that he won't die." It was at that precise moment when the saint was saying these words, as was learned later, that Joseph had sat up in his bed. The fact that the Abbé Vianney had known without ever being told of it, not only the fact that the boy was ill, but even his name, admits of no purely human explanation, but it does not stand alone in the life of the saint. One day in 1855, a country gentleman of Ain, a Monsieur de la Bargue, was calling on his old friend the Abbé Alliot, who was a curé of Amberieu-Doms. Amberieu was about 4 miles from Ars, and in the course of the two men's conversation, the name of Abbé Vianney came up. "You really don't know him, then?" the Abbé Alliot asked. "Never even seen him," Monsieur de la Bargue replied. "I've never set foot in that part of the department. Suppose we go there?" "I should be delighted." The priest and the countryman set off, but the end of the story will be best left to Canon Ball, vice postulator of the Curé d'Ars canonization cause. As soon as they arrived in the village, before going to see the Abbé Vianney, he says, the two men went to the missionaries. A few moments later the curé arrived there too to pay his daily call on his assistants. Everyone rose when he entered, but to the astonishment of M. de la Bargue, the Abbé Vianney, after passing the time of the day with those present in the ordinary way, he came over to him, shook his hand warmly, and greeted him by his name, as if he had been an old acquaintance. Now M. de la Bargue knew for a fact that he had not only never met the Curé d'Ars before, but had never had any sort of dealings with him, either by correspondence or in any other way, since no one had the chance of giving the Abbé Vianney the least hint of the new pilgrim's arrival. M. de la Bargue was overcome with surprise. What had happened, of course, had been that the Abbé Vianney had given a new proof of the gift of supernatural intuition, with which heaven had so richly endowed him, and none of those who were present could convince any other explanation of the fact that had occurred before their eyes. A similar case happened in 1859 when a Lyons cobbler who went in for spiritualism had mingled as a mere sightseer in the crowd that thronged through the Curé d'Ars as he was leaving his church. "Dufour," the curé addressed him, "go back home at once. Your wife is waiting for you impatiently. At this very moment the bailiffs are in your house." The flabbergasted Dufour, for that was his name, seemed unable to take in the words he had heard. "Yes, off with you, my friend," the servant of God continued in kindly tones. "You'll be back here next year." There was hardly one of the pilgrims who was not in a hurry to see and talk to the Curé d'Ars, but it was not infrequent for him to pick out from the crowd those who were really more pressed for time than the rest, and to ask them or send a message to them to come to the confessional before their turn. Such an incident happened one vigil of the Ascension to an M. Godfert, a school teacher of Bourg Saint Christopher in the Aisne. Monsieur Godfert had come to Ars with the intention of staying till the Saturday, and his wife was taking his place in the school as best she could. He was no higher in line than the 13th place of men waiting in the choir of the church, when the Abbé Vianney beckoned to him to come straight to the confessional. M. Godfert confessed, but did not receive absolution. "Come back tomorrow after vespers," the curé told him. The school-teacher duly returned, and when the Abbé Vianney had given him absolution, he told him in tones that admitted of no argument, "My child, you must set off home tomorrow." Monsieur Godfert did as he was told, though he could not help worrying what could have happened at Bourg Saint Christopher that made his prompt return so imperative. He returned back on the Friday evening, however, after a forced march of 25 miles, to find his wife well and his school in perfect order. Madame Godfert was as baffled as her husband at the curé's orders. But the morning of Saturday had hardly begun when the mystery was cleared up in a flash. 7 o'clock was just striking as a touring inspector of education arrived in his carriage. Shortly after the pupils appeared, the inspector soon satisfied himself that everything was in perfect order at Saint Bourg Christopher, with well-behaved children and a model school teacher always at his post. Monsieur Godfert listened to his chief's compliments without turning a hair, but as soon as the inspector's carriage had disappeared round the corner, the Godfert couple looked at each other in eyes with an incredulous air, and after a sigh of relief burst into laughter. Had it not been for the curé's supernatural intuition, the model teacher, who had gone off to Ars without getting leave, would have been absent with his superior arrival and visit. More than one extraordinary chain of events reveals how the Curé d'Ars could read the secrets of men's hearts. About 1855, an Avignon priest, the Abbé Bernard, found himself up against an extremely difficult point of conscience, which it was his duty as a confessor to solve. The nature of the fact was such that it was impossible to seek advice locally, and in any case the Abbé Vianney did not feel that any of his colleagues would be able to help him. Suddenly he remembered the Curé d'Ars and set out to see him. The Abbé Bernard's intention had been to spend no more than a bare hour in the village, for all he had been warned that many pilgrims had to wait 3 days and more before they got to the saint's confessional. He had only to arrive in Ars to see for himself how true the warning was. He had got to be back in Avignon as soon as he possibly could, but he had also got to solve his problem. So he finally reconciled himself to staying on and took a room in the little hotel of Notre Dame des Graces, almost next door to the old presbytery. Next day, about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Abbé Vianney was returning from a visit to a sick-bed. He was crossing the square lined with walnut trees that gave on to the courtyard. and the old church on his way back to his confessional, when onlookers saw him break all his usual habits and make for the hotel where Abbe Bernard was staying. It is easy to understand the visitor's feeling of amazement when a quiet tap at his door was followed by the entry into his room of the white-haired priest, whom he recognized immediately. So familiar had pictures made the saint's features up and down the country, as the Curé de Ars. "My dear fellow," said the Abbé Vianney, greeting him, "I think you've come to consult me over such and such a question. I thought I wouldn't keep you waiting." The curé unravelled the point of conscience with an astonishing rapidity, soundness, and clarity, bade good-bye to the still stupefied visitor, and disappeared with a smile on his lips to hurry back to his confessional. A nun whose community was not very far from ours had long wanted to make the pilgrimage there. She had, of course, religious motive, for she felt a special devotion to Saint Philomena, and had dreamt of being able to pray, as so many others had, in her chapel. She had, however, two other reasons, and there was more than a little curiosity in them. She wanted to see the curé, of whom she only knew by hearsay, and to look at the vestments of the church, whose magnificence was renowned far and wide. She was likely enough the sacristan of her convent. She finally got to ours, and had the good luck to be between the presbytery and the church, just as the curé was crossing the way to go to his confessional. "Sister so-and-so," he said, "come with me," and the nun's own story is the best account of what followed. "He took me to the chapel of Saint Philomena," she said, "and after a few moments of prayer before the statue of the saint, he showed me into the sacristy, where he laid out all the vestments for me to see. Finally he said to me, 'Sister, you come here to say a prayer to Saint Philomena. I've taken you to her chapel. Another reason you come was to look at the vestments. There they are, before your eyes. The last reason you came was to see the Curé de Ars. Here he is, in front of you. You've had everything you wanted. I wish you a very good day.'" The sister could no more than follow the curé's explanation and thank him with a smile, but when she left, her chief source of satisfaction was that she had seen a saint. One day, at the very beginning of February in 1859, a pilgrim of a very unusual kind had just entered the Ars church. Elbowing his way roughly through the crowd, he wanted to see the Abbé Vianney at once, he said. He had not a moment to waste. From his gloomy air and feverish eyes, he might have been taken for a madman, but in fact he was a spiritualist, or claimed to be. Antoine Saubin, for that was his name, was a Lyons workman who had started by summoning up the spirits of the dead and ended by fearing that he might have succeeded only too well. He was being hounded by horrible dreams, and he had come to tell the Curé de Ars about them. The worst of it was that he had to wait. The Abbé Vianney, who had interrupted his confessions for a moment, had left the chapel at St. John the Baptist for the chapel of St. Philomena, and there he was now quietly reciting his breviary. Antoine Saubin had managed to get up within a few feet of him. The spiritualist was familiar enough with the Curé de Ars' reputation as a saint. His knowledge of mythology was, however, more limited than his acquaintance with spiritualism. For him, a saint meant a man whose business it was to help all men, and whose gift it is to read every secret. On that point he was not very far out. But as he sat, fuming with impatience, he merely said to himself, "If this priest really walked with God, as they say he does, he couldn't help knowing that I want to talk to him, and that I'm in a hurry." The thought had hardly entered his mind when the Curé de Ars turned round and answered the words he had never even spoken. "Don't worry, my dear fellow," he said. "Give me a moment, and I'll be with you." Antoine Saubin lost no time in pouring out his nightmares to the servant of God. "All these fancies of yours," the curé told him, "are illusions sent by the devil to mislead you. Do a novena to Our Lady of Fevre, and I assure you it will all stop." Antoine did not confess to the Abbé Vianney, but on his advice he went up to Our Lady of Favre as soon as he returned and laid down the load of his sins at the feet of a Jesuit father. On the following March 19th, the former spiritualist presented himself humbly at the Trappist monastery of Our Lady of the Snows and begged for the privilege of being received as a novice. He became Brother Joachim, and later was one of the Cistercian colony who founded near Ars the magnificent abbey of Our Lady of the Domes, where he died in the calling to which God had summoned him. And we will continue this book next Sunday. We only have 2 chapters left. It's pretty exciting. And thanks for listening to Miss Retro Reads.